Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese is in Shanghai, seeking to bolster business and economic links with his country's largest trading partner.
His visit to China, his second since being re-elected to office, comes amid the backdrop of Trump's tariffs. He's scheduled to meet Chinese President Xi Jinping in Beijing tomorrow for talks on strengthening cooperation. But the issue of Taiwan threatens to cast a shadow on his trip after a senior U.S. official pressed Australia and Japan to state what they would do in a conflict between the U.S. and China over Taiwan.
Mr. Albanese says that Canberra backs the status quo and doesn't support any unilateral action regarding the island. His Defence Industry Minister, Pat Conroy, echoed this, saying Australia doesn't intend to commit its troops in advance to any potential conflict.
And for more insight on Prime Minister Albanese's visit to China, let's speak now with Darren Lim. He's senior lecturer at the School of Politics and International Relations at ANU. He joins us live from Canberra. Darren, good morning. So the 6-day visit we know has been framed, as focus on Australia-China trade, but security, we're all aware, is looming large as well. Taiwan is an obvious one, but there are others like the South Pacific. I mean, I'm wondering how might these security concerns impact, or perhaps derail the economic agenda?
Good morning. I'm not sure they will. I think both sides have an interest in emphasising the positive. Australia really wants to continue building economic relations after the coercion campaign from a few years ago. And China has a real opportunity here to exercise restraint and leadership and contrast itself with Donald Trump's United States. And so, of course, there are significant conflicts of interest, but I suspect that both sides don't want to emphasise those much, certainly not publicly.
Specifically, I want to ask you about Australia's statement saying that it won't commit in advance to a hypothetical conflict over Taiwan. What sort of message does this refusal to commit in advance send to allies like Japan and the U.S., and how might that affect the trust within the AUKUS framework?
I think it's an entirely normal reaction in normal times. No government would be expected to commit in advance, especially given we can't be sure how the United States would respond. So if you're sitting in Tokyo or other regional capitals around the region, this is a normal response. Now, of course, we're not dealing with a normal US administration, and we know that they have a pattern of making demands of other countries, whether it's on tariffs or it's on this security issue. So I suspect the refusal to say anything stronger won't go down well in Washington, but they really can't expect anything different, given it's possible that Donald Trump could make a deal with Xi Jinping at some point in the future over Taiwan, right? He's mused about that in the past. And so when the world cannot be sure how the United States is going to react, it's not reasonable and certainly cannot be expected that anyone else is going to make a commitment now.
Darren, I also want to ask you about the South Pacific, where Australia believes China wants to set up a military presence, a base. Do you see, Albanese pressing hard, for the region to be one, and I'm quoting directly, where no one dominates? I'm quoting Pat Conroy. I mean, or do you see basically Beijing and Australia trying to continue to exert its influence in that part of the world?
Of course. The South Pacific is an area of contestation. The Australian government has said explicitly it is concerned about China's moves to build a military presence there, and we've been clear that it's not in our interest for that to happen. I wouldn't expect that this will, again, feature prominently in the bilateral relationship in those discussions. The Australian government's strategy is to make itself the partner of choice for South Pacific countries, and so engaging directly with them, offering them a more attractive, deal on security and on economics in order to try to persuade them not to become too close with Beijing. So China will continue, I expect, to look to build that relationship, and Australia will look to counter it, but bilaterally with the region rather than going through Beijing and that relationship.
And Darren, the meeting comes amid Trump's tariff blitz targeting both allies and rivals. How might his threats impact Australia's ties with China? Could it indirectly encourage Albanese to diversify away from the U.S.?
Look, this is the big question. Australia has clear conflicts of interest with China, but the United States is an increasingly unreliable partner. Now, our security relationship with the United States is long, and it is really impossible to imagine it being severely affected. So I think the interesting things to look for are at the margins, right? Are we going to develop slightly closer relationships with China than we otherwise would if there were, a more orthodox administration in place? China certainly wants greater involvement in the Australian economy. They want more foreign investment. They want Australia to embrace their technology stack on artificial intelligence. We've seen China's ambassador to Australia propose that Australia look to cooperate on AI. Now, we would expect normally that Australia would rebuff these advances. We like to keep our relationship with China at arm's length. We want to sell them many commodities, food and minerals, but we don't want them too involved in our domestic economy. And we did that through banning Huawei from our 5G network, back in 2018. But that's where the pressure points lie, right? Can China build a stronger presence here in Australia, embrace Australia a bit more tightly, rather than what I think the government would prefer, which is that arm's length relationship? Now, I'm not expecting any major concessions to be made, but that is where the absence of US leadership and erratic behaviour by the president could, over time, create those forces that push countries even like Australia slightly closer to China.
Darren, I want to ask you in a related matter, about this whole concept of strategic ambiguity. It's something that many countries have used for a long time now, including the United States, I should add. But I'm wondering if it's still going to work for Australia in this Trump era. I mean, can Australia continue to be a key US defense partner against China and still have unfettered access to Chinese markets and consumers?
Well, that exactly is the delicate dance that Prime Minister Albanese is looking to maintain and continue this week. Look, strategic ambiguity on the issue of Taiwan is a common sense approach. No one wants to commit in advance. There is an incentive to deter any unilateral actions by Beijing, but also an incentive to prevent Taiwan from doing anything to disrupt the status quo unilaterally. Australia supports the status quo, and for the moment, the US still does as well. But what your question gets at is this sort of bigger tension about whether or not maintaining a strong security relationship with the United States, which is essential. There is no other alternative. Our military is so intertwined with the US military that going it alone remains inconceivable for Australia. But whether maintaining that does jeopardize the economic relationship and the political relationship with Beijing. And Australia has learned in recent years how, if you push out too far in one direction, that resulted in a backlash from China and a campaign of economic coercion, which saw us, $20 billion worth of economic trade affected. Now, I don't think it's in China's interest to push too hard, but that is the basic contradiction here. And it's not one that can be easily resolved. It requires very, very skilled and deft diplomacy, and that's what the Prime Minister is going to need to display this week.
Darren, great talking to you this morning. Appreciate your time and your thoughts. Darren Lim is Senior Lecturer at the School of Politics and International Relations at ANU.